thank you very much for everyone for coming to see the film. And I'm sorry, in a way, we're not going to have a discussion afterwards, and it would have been nice. But hopefully I'll just mention a few things which might provoke you to think, look for a few things while you're watching the film, and which I expect will be wonderful on this large screen. So when Diane asked me to choose a Godard film to present as part of the tribute to the director who, as you know, died in September, I chose Le Mépris partly because it's my favorite Godard films with À bout de souffle, and I'm currently planning to write a book about it. Well, I'm planning a book about it. And it is, of course, beyond my own taste, one of Godard's most important films in a long and illustrious filmography. Of course, I'm also interested because it features Bardot, who is very much central to the film. And also, as you can see from the quotes that I put on the slide on the right, it's a controversial film. And so if nothing else, if this is your first viewing, you might decide on which side you are of those, especially the negative ones were at the time of the film coming out. There was quite a lot of that. And then the top ones are more recent, and I think it's part of a general trend in the film acquiring gradually the status of a classic, very much revered. And even if you don't share Colin McCabe's sort of slightly over-the-top opinion, I think this translates what a lot of people think about it. Okay, so I'm assuming, and I'm sorry for those of you who are very familiar with the film, but I'm assuming there are also people here who've never seen it. So it's the film Le Mépris, Contempt, like the novel by Alberto Moravia on which it is based, is set in the film world, in Rome and then in Capri. The main character, Paul, Michel Piccoli, is a scriptwriter who has to decide whether he must write a new, more commercial adaptation of the Odyssey, directed by Fritz Lang, playing himself in the film. In the process, his relationship with his wife Camille, Bardot, unravels. She starts to feel contempt for him because he is prostituting his talents for money, and that includes pushing her in the arms of the American producer Prokosch, played by Jack Palance. Okay, so I was asked to place the film briefly in the context of the New Wave, and again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. But to backtrack a little, Godard's first features on my slide are obviously at the core of the French New Wave, the movement of which he was a founding member in the late 50s. And like Truffaut, Chabrol, Romer, and a few others, he began as a film critic at Cahiers du Cinéma, watching films at the Cinémathèque Française and in film clubs. And this love of the cinema, his cinephilia, informs absolutely all his work, and indeed, as you will see, very much Le Mépris. The New Wave was never a unified movement, and I'm obviously not trying to summarize it in 2 minutes, but just to say that the films, including Godard's, shared a number of features. The desire to make modern, spontaneous-looking films, a modernity always defined as a rebellion against the French quality cinema of the 1950s, the cinéma de papa. And New Wave films tended to be black and white, so despite the colorful posters, most of them, except one, low-budget films shot on location with small crews and no established stars, often breaking classic editing and narrative rules. It's obviously a big generalization, but I think it holds true. Culturally, the point of the New Wave, and this is important for Godard, was to elevate the figure of the director as auteur, as supreme creative authority, on a par with other arts. And what's amazing looking at this set of posters is that in the space of 3 years, on top of several short films, which are not there, Godard made 6 feature films, the 5 you have here, and Le Mépris. These all borrow from different genres, so the musical, Une femme est une femme, sociological exposé of Vivre sa vie, the war film, Le Petit Soldat, but they all share Godard's innovative editing and fragmented narration, and most of them star Anna Karina, probably the best-known New Wave star of all. And as you know, a Danish model turned actress, a muse for Godard, who also married her. And all these features are very relevant to Le Mépris. But let me pause for a minute on À bout de souffle, which many of you, I imagine, if not all, have seen, a film that really epitomizes Godard's rule-breaking cinema, shot on the street and of Paris and the hotels, made on a small budget, despite the American star Gene Seberg. It is remarkable for its rapid editing, with the famous jump cuts, the disjointed narrative, and self-conscious cinephilia, again, with tributes to film noir and Humphrey Bogart, among others. And in many ways, À bout de souffle is the manifesto film for the New Wave, just, I think, like Le Mépris is a manifesto for its ending, for its end. Yet, the two films share several features, and most obviously, an unusual narrative structure with a long 25-minute sequence at the heart of both films, the hotel room in À bout de souffle and the Roman flat in Le Mépris. But, and what's interesting, and so you can think of that while you're watching the film, that in the first film, of course, the sequence is mostly about love between the characters played by Belmondo and Seberg, and in Le Mépris, it is about the end of that love. Now, while Le Mépris is a very Godardian film, it is also a radical departure from his earlier work. When asked to comment on this, when Le Mépris came out in December 1963, Godard facetiously replied that the only difference was that it had cost a lot of money. Not $5 million, as he was dreaming of, but 5 million francs, which was still quite a lot of money for a European production at the time. And in this respect, Le Mépris is a typical Euro-American co-production of the period, a large-scale project which was assembled by a disparate lot of producers. So there was a French producer, Georges de Beauregard, who was used to producing New Wave films, the Italian tycoon Carlo Ponti, here on my slide with his wife, Sophia Loren, who, of course, he wanted to cast in the film before the choice went to Bardot, and the American Joseph Levine. Le Mépris, in the publicity campaign in '63, presented it as Godard's traditional film. Of course, it was anything but, and predictably, Godard clashed with the producers. He ended up calling Mussolini Ponti and King Kong Levine. The conflict was ostensibly about Godard's way of filming Bardot, and I'll come to that in a minute, but it was really about Godard asserting his authorial status against the forces of commerce in the film that are caricatured in the figure of Prokosch, the crass producer played by Jack Palance. Now, moving on to the film itself, I'm going to say a few words about Le Mépris as about three things: about the making of a film, about the unmaking of a couple, and about Bardot. So now, films about film in the history of cinema are actually quite common, but Le Mépris goes beyond a story of the film milieu to offer a deep reflection on film history as well as on filmmaking. This takes several forms, and I just want to indicate the major ones, in my opinion, for you to watch while during the screening of the film. First of all, of course, the film makes us immediately aware of the apparatus. In a classic Brechtian distancing technique, the film opens with, this is the picture top left, with the director of photography, Raoul Coutard, behind a huge camera. And then we move on to the Cinecittà studios and the making of the film in Capri, and where we see the film within the film being made. So that's the kind of one level. The second level is that of citations and tributes. There are posters, and you can see the pictures at the bottom, but you will see better when you in the film itself. There's, of course, Godard's own Vivre sa vie, which is there, but also Psycho and Hatari by Hitchcock and Howard Hawks, that were two major models for the cahier critique. So in the very fabric of the film, in that sense, you have those citations that are very close to Godard's own taste and training as a critic. But also you will see there are books about the cinema, mentions in the dialogue, and so on. Then on another level, one could say that Le Mépris embodies critical theory in a way, that it shows the politique des auteurs in the flesh in two ways. First of all, Fritz Lang, who represents the cultured European auteur who was able to retain his artistic integrity even in Hollywood. So one can see him as one split alter ego of Godard, and the other one, a more obvious alter ego, is the character of Paul, the scriptwriter, Michel Piccoli, as the archetypal artist in crisis figure. And it's well known that during the film, even Godard gave him his own clothes to wear, his suits, his hat, apparently even his socks. And so there's very much an embodiment of the politique des auteurs in that way. But I think on yet another level, the film is about artistic lineage. And through Godard playing the character of Fritz Lang's assistant in a very Hitchcockian cameo. I mean, it's the top right picture. You can't see him, but you will see him at the end of the film. Godard implicitly places himself as an heir to the great filmmaker tradition, Fritz Lang himself, but everything that he represents. I'm tempted to say the sort of great white male tradition, but I won't develop that, it's sort of fairly obvious. But also as part of an older cultural tradition, the mythology through the Odyssey, art more generally. So the film is replete with that sort of cultural, very, very dense cultural references, which through playing Lang's assistant, Godard places himself, in the center of that. And then, of course, finally, it's a film about stardom. And Bardot's presence in the film works on two levels. She's the character Camille, supposedly an ordinary woman, a typist, but she's, of course, also and especially the extraordinary star, Brigitte Bardot. And I think one of the interesting aspects of the film, and which we could discuss, is how the film makes us see that it's very aware of that duality in Bardot playing Camille and Bardot playing Bardot. Now, just say very quickly, another interpretation is that the theme of the unmaking of a couple echoes, of course, the end of Godard's own relationship with Carina, or marriage, although they would go on to make other important films together after Le Mépris. They made Bande à part, Alphaville, and Pierrot le Fou. But Carina reported recognizing many of her own words coming out of Bardot's mouth in the film. So Godard really sort of literally took those from his real life to put them in the film. And Le Mépris, and of course it's partly because I'm interested in stars and Bardot in particular, to me is a particularly interesting aspect, is that it's about the most famous new wave auteur trying to control the biggest European star of the era. In 1963, Bardot was still a huge media phenomenon, a celebrity relentlessly pursued by paparazzi. And as some of you may know, Jacques Rosier, Godard's assistant, made a documentary, well, a couple of documentaries, but one is called Paparazzi, and it documents the way Bardot was being chased by and also actually chasing the paparazzi while they were shooting the film in Capri. And there are lots of amusing anecdotes about Godard and Bardot battling against each other about the length of her skirts or the height of her hairstyle. Godard famously wanted her to get rid of her choucroute hairstyle that you can see here because it was too high, and Bardot refused, saying that she would do exactly what she wanted with her hair. So there were all sorts of anecdotes about how he managed to get her to do that. But I think what's interesting is the fact that he is also beyond his anecdotes. This is about Godard battling for authorial control. He needed Bardot to be Bardot, the sex symbol, yet he also wanted to mold her according to the needs of his film. And it seems to me quite symbolic in a way that he wanted to literally diminish her he thought that he objected to the choucroute because he said it was too high. It was 15 centimeters. And I suspect it made her taller than him, but yeah. So he put her in a black wig and more modest dresses to imitate Anna Karina, and so you have a picture of that on the right-hand side. But you will note, however, that of course the poster that you saw on my first slide uses Bardot's signature big blonde hair and plunging décolleté. Okay, but there is more in relation to Bardot and Godard. Carlo Ponti and Joe Levine were famously dissatisfied with the film. I mean, having commissioned Godard, they of course didn't like having a Godard film, and they ordered a re-edit from which Godard withdrew his name. And there were several versions going around, including one in Italy, which could not be shown in France. Godard refused to have it shown in France, and partly because France was apparently at the time the only country that legally gave the director as auteur the right, the last cut, as it were. But Joe Levine was especially furious with the lack of Bardot nudity and forced Godard to film new scenes to display the famous body. That was, of course, the point of attraction of having Bardot in the film, and knowing that half of the budget of the film went to her. And Godard did it, but of course in a very Godardian manner. Distant and ironic, with Bardot naming the parts of her own body, and you have the pictures on the left here, and the images filtered through the colors that you can see, which some people think are the colors of the French flag, so it's blue, white, and red. But in any case, it is advertising that distance that Godard wants us to have from Bardot's body, saying, you want her, here she is, but again, in a very self-reflexive, ostentatious manner. And it should be said that despite her clashes with Godard, and they didn't really get on during the shoot, Bardot, nevertheless, as a professional, sided with him against the producer and also expressed delight as being part of the new wave. And of course, as well she might, because while the film does not sum up her career, and Bardot was primarily a star of popular French cinema, it nevertheless turned her into a cinephile icon. And the image of her from the film that you see here on the right is probably one of the best known images of Bardot down the generations. Okay, to conclude, I spoke very briefly of Le Mépris as a film about an intellectual filmmaker in crisis, about a marriage falling apart, and about an analysis, a dissection of Bardot. There is no time, unfortunately, to discuss the wonderful use of color and look at the way Godard creates splashes of primary colors, which became part of his visual signature, and part of the extraordinary visual beauty of the film, or the slow rhythm of the film. For example, that there are about a third of the number of shots compared to À bout de souffle. Or perhaps even most noticeable, the elegiac music by Georges Delerue, which contributes a lot to the nostalgic aura of the film, the sense that it's about an ending. And yet, for Godard, Le Mépris was only the end of his new wave period, amazingly, of only the first 3 years of his career. And he would go on to make many more great films analyzing the modernization of 1960s France, so Pierrot le Fou, Alphaville, Une femme mariée, Deux ou trois choses que je sais d'elle, and so on. And then later a little bit later, turning to more political and more formally radical filmmaking. And I think Le Mépris, seen as part of his whole career, marks the first of a series of reinventions that would recur throughout his long career that went into the 21st century. And unfortunately, I think that's all I have time to say, but I very much hope you enjoy the film, which I look forward to watching on the big screen myself. Thank you.